Hi and welcome everyone to this CTO Craft Bytes event about perfecting the product and technology relationship. For those of you that don't know us, CTO Craft, we're a community of technology leaders. I think there's about 1,500 of us now. So if you wish to come and join us, we run events like this, discussion groups, provide services like coaching and workshops. And of course, there's the upcoming CTO Craft conference, beginning of December. Today, I'm joined by three very distinguished guests. Firstly, there's Marc Abraham, who's the head of product at ASOS. And secondly, we've got Marta Jasinska, CTO of Bloom & Wild. And thirdly, we've got John Holloway, who's an interim CTO and pirate. So, guys, would you like to briefly introduce yourselves to the audience? Marta, maybe first.
Sure, yes. Hi, everyone. Like Dan said, I'm the CTO of Bloom & Wild. I've been doing this for a while now. I've been an engineer and an architect for about 7 years of my career. And then for the last 7 years, I've been in various kind of management, leadership, tech/product roles across companies that deal with physical product and technology. I think the most relevant for today's conversation is that I spent a good year at Mo Print, which is my previous company, working across both technology and product functions. So I have that CTPO experience, which I'm really keen to chat a bit more about.
Great, thanks. Marc?
Yes, I'm Marc. Thanks for having me. I've been a product person for about 9 years now, and worked always very closely in or with engineering or cross-functional teams. And I've been at ASOS for nearly 2 years now, initially as a practice lead, helping to establish the kind of product mindset and product function. And since end of last year, as one of the heads of product looking after engagement, so things like CRM and customer retention. And I've recently published my second book, which is called Managing Product Equals Managing Tension. And the reason why I'm excited about this conversation today is because I do talk about engineering and product as one of the tensions in my book.
Great. John?
And I'm John Holloway. I'm interim and kind of fractional CTO. So the fractional CTO is some businesses a couple of days a month, a few days a month. And then I take on kind of typically one interim kind of role as well. So those are a mixture of, I look after product and engineering in some of the kind of the fractional pieces. And I also kind of look after engineering in my main kind of interim role.
Sorry, I've muted myself by mistake. And I'm Dan Smith. I CTO coach, work at CTO Craft, and also a bit like John, interim fractional CTO, and perform some technical due diligence kind of work as well. So thanks all for coming. I wanted to say a couple of things before we start. If there's a fire, then please leave by the nearest fire exit. Secondly, ask questions, please. We've got this great panel. They know everything. And if you've got a question, there's an ask a question button somewhere down here. You click on that and ask the question, and I will do my best to bring these to the panel. I always find that these kind of events are great where people bring live issues that we can discuss. And just above that, there's also tell me about CTO Craft Con, the conference. So please click on there if you haven't already signed up. Marc mentioned their tension. So looking at the kind of priorities in the business, there's often a tension. There really should be a tension, a creative tension. Sometimes can spill over into something a bit less healthy. But if we think about the kind of business priorities, the product priorities, and the technical priorities, how do you see that companies can best manage this to create the most sort of creative environment to get the best results for everyone?
Yeah, if I can maybe as a starter for 10, and I've seen companies do this, different degrees, some well, some not so well, is for me, a lot of it starts with the objective setting at the top. Because if you're very clear on what the business objectives are, then it becomes a shared conversation from from an engineering perspective, from a product perspective, of what do we need to do, or how can we contribute towards achieving those objectives? Whether it's, and again, every business will say revenue is our main objective and profit is our objective, but that's not, I'm talking a bit more granular than that, where we say we want to enter X new markets, for instance, or we want to improve customer retention. In companies where I've seen this working well is that you've really get that kind of filtering down from the top to the bottom, and it makes it easier for product people, for designers, for engineers to really think, okay, what, I understand the context, what can we do to achieve that goal?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it's really interesting to talk about company level objectives. I think you're right that alignment at that objective level is really important. For me, it starts even a step earlier. I think it's really important that technology and product and business set those objectives together and talk together about the outcomes that they're going after. Where I see technology, especially bringing a lot of value in those conversations, is a bit of a, healthy skepticism, asking questions like, you're going after revenue, but what if, we have a major outage? What if we're not able to ship orders because we implemented features too quickly, right? Bringing that kind of questioning and ensuring that we are actually prioritizing the right things at the objective setting level. And aligning not on objectives themselves, but also on the outcomes. Sorry.
And I think that's a great point. And similar to engineers, I expect product people to ask a lot of questions at a strategic level, exactly as Marta says. I think the reality is, especially with larger companies, product people, I can't speak for engineers, aren't necessarily part of that conversation always. And again, you have to, because you have so many layers that you have to go through. But yeah, that would be ideal if we can at least be involved with setting the vision even before you start then breaking it down to specific objectives.
John, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so and I think that's a kind of good point, is that the business objectives are typically, it works best when you get everybody together from the different disciplines, and I think there's a tendency, particularly with OKRs, where I've seen people break things down in silos without understanding the kind of dependencies between kind of product engineering, marketing, etc. And that typically ends in a bit of a it's not always clear who the input from each kind of department into each other's kind of objectives, and it makes things very difficult if they're not aligned. So I think alignment kind of is incredibly important there.
Okay, so it's great. We all agreed that alignment's incredibly important and desirable. What happens when there isn't alignment? How can people get around that? I'm sure we've got people in the audience that are thinking, oh, this sounds great, but in my company it's X, Y, Z. And if it is, please put your question in about specific kind of, we won't name the companies, but the kind of situation you're in. But if there is no alignment and you're in a role where you can't particularly kind of lead the agenda, what else could you do to help this kind of relationship be effective?
I think different people can play a different and very important role in this process. Like, even if you're an engineer on a team and you feel like decisions are being made, levels above you, the best thing you can do is bring that conversation to people around you, speak about the things that you're seeing that you are worried about, and ask questions. And the moment you start asking questions, if those questions are valid and if your concerns are really hitting, you're gonna be put in front of more and more people that want to hear from you and want to talk to you. But I think engineers and product people, to Marc's point as well, we have a responsibility to be asking those questions of our business partners, because running a business is not just going after a single growth metric. Running a business is much complicated than that, and there's a lot of complexity that goes into that engineering and product can help. And actually, we have skills in the management layer, in the product management layer, to tackle those complexities and to simplify them. Mm-hmm. I think the big source of tension that I experienced in previous companies is where there's misunderstanding or a bit of fuzziness around the expectations between engineering, product, and business. And you kind of avoid attacking those fuzzy kind of borders between those roles. You avoid talking about, okay, I expect you to focus on this. I expect you to ask those questions. And then you end up people disagreeing, but not talking about it and not resolving those issues.
And I think And Dan, if you allow me, this is the first time and hopefully the only time in our conversation today where I'm going to be slightly controversial or maybe a bit of a naive hippie, where it's interesting when we talk about product engineering and the business. And I find that a lot, especially when I work in larger organizations, when they say, yeah, that's the business make that decision. And it's so interesting. I don't know if you've got that experience, John or Marta, when you ask who is the business, you get a different answer every single time I ask this.
Yeah.
And I always really try to work with at least the people in my team as product managers or product owners is we are all the business. So we should all be part of that conversation, as we said before. And I totally agree with Marta. Even if there's not that alignment, it means that it puts the onus on whether it's engineers or product people to really make sure they are clear on why we're doing it, even if they don't agree with it, and particularly what outcomes and what results we're going after and who's doing what.
I think there's a lot of bias in some companies in terms of the way things have always been done. And what I've typically found is that marketing-led companies and kind of e-commerce companies are kind of typical of this. That the business is a group of marketeers getting together to kind of talk about how the business will evolve. What I've typically found with that I've certainly worked in businesses where product and engineering were not part of those discussions.
Yeah.
And the result of that is that if you focus and you're biased towards one kind of, this is where your time is going to be spent, and you know what, don't worry about all the other stuff that's there. You typically end up with unhappy people in product and engineering, and specifically engineering in this case, where it was a case of we were very much told, the tail does not wag the dog, and that was the kind of the thing that came back as well. Yeah, and my point is why? Because you should be able to have a very sensible discussion between all departments and a very balanced kind of viewpoint rather than it being biased towards one specific aspect.
Yeah, I think it's, from what I've seen, it's a bit of inertia. Like we've always worked in a certain way, and particularly if it's not necessarily a technology or product-led company, if you want to call it that. But the one thing I would say, again, maybe the second controversial thing, or just an anecdote from a few years ago where I worked at a large company, and even though the CTO had a stake, was involved in conversations, this CTO had what I would say, I call an IT mindset, where it was very much, even he talked like, yeah, the business wants this, so we better do it, or the business doesn't want this, so we shouldn't be doing it. So you can see, John, that even when there was that representation, that mindset of thinking much more about the customer, thinking like Marta was saying about trade-offs or asking why, asking those questions, even though you had the representation, it wasn't quite there just yet. This is a few years ago, but you can see, the IT versus what I call product mindset.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think likewise as well with kind of tech-focused companies. I mean, you look at hard tech, you look at moonshot tech. Those businesses typically take 10 years to kind of discover, do the R&D and get to kind of a certain point. And it's very much the case that adding a kind of product, kind of voice within that is critical to the kind of success. So basically it's taking kind of 10, 15 years to kind of achieve your R&D goal, as opposed to kind of, 3 or 4, but it depends.
But in my experience, a lot of like people who don't understand tech and product, they fall back onto those, things that may not be right, may not be real, but they fall back on those stereotypes. It's because they don't really understand the value that product thinking and kind of product and tech ways of working can bring to the business. And I'm a big fan of kind of looking at the tool set available, across experience of tech and product companies, for many years now, and looking at which tools are going to help me bring the value to the teams that I'm working with. And if the fact is that, my most senior person on the tech team is IT minded and they don't really understand the value of product way of working, and maybe, my head of marketing never worked with a product manager before, and they don't really like that way of working, you can still, show them the value of adjusting their ways of working and introduce them a bit slowly into the process. I think it's good to be able to flex a bit around the people that you have available as well, because that way you can take them on this journey and you can all move towards a better organization in the future.
Great. Right. There's lots to say here, but I've got some questions coming in, so I'd like to answer those. So one of those is an interesting one. So does the question of alignment between product and engineering suggest they're independent reporting lines with a separate CTO and CPO? So we sometimes see organizations where the head of technology reports to head of product, or vice versa, or they're separate lines reporting directly to CTO. What's right? And obviously some organizations, they might be more right for one kind of structure than another. What do you see there, and what do you recommend?
It depends is the classic product management answer. I think the key, I've worked in setups where I've reported to a CTO, equally up to recently at ASOS, I had a chief product officer who we were looking to replace, because he's moved on. But I think the only thing I would say where I've worked really well with the CTO, whether it was as a direct line report or just as a colleague almost, is if they had a bit of that product mindset. I totally agree that I've learned over the years to also adopt a bit more of an IT mindset and be less zealous about product, and product mindset is so great. But it does help if you have a CTO who has got a product function under him or her, that he or she has that product mindset, because otherwise I've seen situations where product people felt like, well, it's always about the engineers and I don't get a look in, and there's no room to experiment or talk to customers because the CTO doesn't get it.
Mm-hmm. And I guess it depends, but are there sort of particular circumstances where you imagine that one person reporting to the other would be advantageous?
I think reporting lines at the C-level to solve a tension between product managers and engineering team is like, bringing a big gun to a really small knife fight. I think the question of whether product and tech should report into a single, C-level individual, or should it be split, it's really a cross-organizational question. Like, what is our product? Is it software? Is it something else? How we develop this product? Like there's a lot of questions you need to answer before you can say what is the right org design for tech and product in this particular business. And even if you answer this question and you set up the best organization for your business, you still may have a tension between engineers and products, because you may have a tension at the different level of management, or you may have a tension that we talked about, misalignment on objectives, or many other tensions. And I think expecting that putting everything under a single leader is going to solve it is quite naive, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think also, just practically speaking, thinking about numbers, especially if you have a large team of product people. So I'm thinking at ASOS, for instance, where you've got 30 plus product owners, you've got about 15 product designers, and one person do that as well as looking after a huge technology department, right? So that's just a practical aspect to consider as well.
Okay, great. Another question here. What tangible mechanisms can you use in order to bring the silos together? Product, engineering, marketing, sales, the business. So challenging you to come up with some real tangibles. Yeah,
so I've got very simple mechanisms. I'm going to share at least one of them. So one of the things that I always encourage my teams to do, not just at ASOS, but other places as well, is do like what I call a product retrospective. So, you normally have like an agile team retrospective where you look at the health of the team and look at ways of working, whereas this is purely focused on the product, where you look at, as a cross-functional group of people beyond your team, your development team, it's a really great opportunity to look at. We released this 3 months ago. How's it been performing? What are the numbers? What were the assumptions that went into that? What are we planning next? And I know it's a super basic mechanism, but it works really well because it's light. Everyone can relate to it. And it's a nice opportunity for me as a product person to bring the marketing person in, to get the engineers excited because they can demo things. The product person can talk about the data, but you can see how everyone is in the room and everyone is part of a product journey.
I think that's great, just because, realizing ROI and really kind of understanding what you've done. Lots of people ship a feature and forget about it.
Yeah.
And the follow-up, it just often isn't there. And it's really great when you've got a product and engineering kind of function that coming together to actually review something, and the engineers go, oh, this is the result of what we've actually shipped kind of 3 months ago, and this is the impact of it. But I think a lot of that kind of gets lost sometimes because of lack of observability, particularly within the product and the kind of the platform. And what some of the things we've been doing recently there is very much trying to kind of improve the observability of those, so we can look back at the actual kind of metrics and say, look, we've just improved one of our algorithms to 95% accuracy from 65% as a result of the change we've done, and this is the impact it's had on the operations team in terms of reducing the manual effort involved there. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. I've got a question there, Mark, in terms of how often would you run those? Would you run those quarterly or would you run those monthly?
Depends, is the honest answer. So when I was in startups, I would do them a bit more regularly because we had a lot more to ship in a relatively short space of time, but definitely quarterly at least. Gives you a nice window to reflect back on and to look ahead on.
Yeah, I love that. I would also add, if you have a business stakeholder or whoever was like on the business side of the project who also attend, right? Because they're gonna be interested in those.
100%. That's one of the first things I do, and I do another really simple thing, which particularly, and I've done it all the places I've worked, but particularly at ASOS, where products is still a relatively new thing. It's had a few incarnations, but you can imagine different people, different ideas. So I do knowledge shares with other product people who will come into the business or virtually, and we just very informal Chatham House Rules kind of session, and they talk about their product function, how they're structured, some challenges that they have, and it's just a two-way conversation, which I don't only open up to the product people, but to engineers, to people in HR, to people in marketing, because for me, I found that over the years to be a very effective tool to get that kind of shared understanding, and understanding that's not like, oh, you've got these very special product rock stars, but that's much more about a mindset, and that we're all working towards solving the same problems and dealing with the same challenges.
Okay, I've got another question come in. The client I'm working with have very strong business vision, clearly articulate where the business and its customers are going. The gap is that product then basically throw requirements over the wall. How do you break down that wall and get joined up working?
Shall I take it from a product perspective? So the first thing, and again, I've seen a bit of that, not necessarily ASOS, but in other places, and I really encourage product people to engage with engineers and designers early and often. And it starts with that question and making people aware that that's what they need to do, because some product people, again, sometimes not to a fault of their own, are working in that silo. And I'll say to them, Mark, they'll tell me I'm going to do a kickoff session, or I'm going to do a brainstorming session. I'm going to show a design to the marketing team. It's like, if you run that by an engineer, have you checked it with design? I know it sounds really childish, but really that is the way to make sure that happens. When I do a kickoff session, I make sure we've got a really good cross-functional group of people involved in that, even if we're not anywhere near writing a single line of code or thinking about designs. But that whole concept of taking people on that journey early and often is so critical if you want to build that relationship and that trust that we talked about.
Yeah,
I think encouraging. Sorry.
So my advice to the engineers on the team would be just to try to find a way to ask those questions and challenge, but in a positive way. Especially if you have a strong vision from the business already, you understand what you're trying to achieve. Try to flip the script a bit and talk with your product manager and show them that you can bring value by asking those questions, helping them formalize those stories. So you are making their work easier as well. Show that involving you early is bringing a lot of value to the process as well.
I think engineers need some encouragement there, particularly in terms of speaking up sometimes. And I very much with outsourced teams as well, there are cultural kind of issues there with getting buy-in from engineering. But I think it's so critical to engage with your senior engineers and just generally early on to really understand. Okay, we'd like to build this. What are the different ways in which we can build it, and what are the trade-offs between it? Because most often than not, I've certainly seen this problem with engineers. It's like, you say this is what we want to build, And that's like, okay, there's a nod of the head and off to go and build it and come back. And it's like, okay. And then you find out what the problems are. So it's, I think involving them early on is absolutely critical.
Because that's another tendency, like the question is asking really, is that I want engineers and designers and stakeholders involved in the problem phase, not the solution phase. And lots of companies I've seen, engineers only come in at, the solution phase, when typically the solution, if it's really bad, has already been signed off and they just need to engineer it, right?
Yeah, my favorite question at that problem phase to engineers is like, how do we solve this problem without writing code? Like, how can you get to a solution without even creating any overhead? So, and again, engineers can help with that. They can really point places in the platform or in the system where product people will not know about.
Yeah. I do think there's a role for, not just for us on the panel, but I presume a lot of people on the call, is how do we create like an environment where people, both sides, feel comfortable to have those conversations and to challenge and do it in such a way that it doesn't feel like I'm directly personally attacking John, but I'm just saying, we're in this together, John, and let me come up with ideas, or let's go back to the problem. And that is often the key thing, because sometimes, the number of product people I've spoken to over the years who say to me, Mark, the engineers are ganging up on me, they're ruling and it's, no, how can we as leaders, if you like, or let's say just create those environments where it's safe to challenge, to explore ideas. That's a key step in this process, I think.
I mean, I think ability to facilitate conversations, regardless of where you're at the management layer, is a key thing for any leader or any manager, project managers, product managers, agile coaches, engineering managers. Like, we need to be able to facilitate positive conversations where people feel safe speaking up.
I think ideation is a big problem here, and the kind of routes into which an idea can actually evolve. And maybe that's, I think involving the right people in that, not just kind of product managers, but engineers as well, and that anybody in the business can come up with an idea, and that idea goes through the same product discovery kind of mechanism as everything else. But I think often the product meeting is a very separate entity, and some people say, and you'll say to the engineers, you're welcome to come along to it. In some cases they don't get invited, but I would say that that's the best time. It's like, this is what we've been thinking about, this is our kind of like what we're thinking about in terms of user journey mapping, or this is what we're looking at building with the prototype in Azure. What do you think of this? What kind of feedback can we get as early on as possible to kind of make sure that you're shortcutting the problems and solving the problems earlier on, rather than solving them in an operational environment, which is way more costly, right? And yeah.
And what about, I still hear these days like CTOs, but particularly developers who say, well, I'm just not interested in the product or the business. I just want to write code.
I mean,
what can you do about that?
There are places where you can go and do just that. There are organizations where engineers are there to produce lines of code. There's plenty still examples of that, and if this is what you want to do, that's great. I think in a successful product-led team or product-led organization, you're gonna struggle as an engineer, as a leader. If this is not what you want to engage with, this is not what you want to do. I think you're gonna struggle with your career and your kind of day-to-day engagement with your work.
I think some of those companies are great places. Like, you look at B2B companies, you look at tech-first companies, obviously. And as an engineer where you just want to kind of solve programming kind of problems, then fine. That might be a place where you can survive. But if you're very much in a kind of a B2C kind of company, and the product is kind of customer facing, I think for to be called a senior engineer, you absolutely need to have commercial kind of commercial skills, and you have to be able to kind of get out there and talk with the rest of the business. And that was probably one of the best bits of advice somebody gave me earlier on in my career was, as an engineer, get out from behind your keyboard, go and talk to the rest of the business, find out what's going on.
And I think, I totally agree with you, John. And I think it's not even if you don't have those skills, or you're still feeling a bit uncomfortable with the business side, whatever that is, just asking those questions, going to those meetings, just listening in, having a chat with the CMO and understanding a bit more about their strategy. Such a great starting point. And yes, I think because it also helps in turn, if you want to manage, so if I'm an engineering leader and I want to manage other engineers, to give people context. So even if those people that you're line managing just want to code, cool. But I still notice that people want to know why they're coding and what they're coding and what the impact is, right?
Yeah, much more often I get engineers wanting to know than not wanting to know. I think we usually are on the other side, actually.
Okay, great. I've got another question. Could you distill the difference between a product mindset and an engineering mindset? And I guess there, do they have to be two separate mindsets? Is there a third way, fourth way?
I think if you break it down, there's a lot of overlap, but the key key expression of a product mindset is someone who asks a lot of questions and is really curious. And again, that's not, I always make the point, like, you don't need a product person to have that mindset, but you need that mindset if you want to develop successful products.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you need to be curious and ask a lot of questions to be good an engineer as well. I think what we have is like product skills and engineering skills. And then you have people with different mindsets and different ways of working and different ways of thinking about problems. I think engineers, engineering skills are to do with how do you solve those problems? How do you make things work in production? There's, coding, designing, operating the code in production. And product is, among many things, about asking the why, but also about organizing the work, organizing the priorities, managing stakeholders. There's a lot of skills that go into it. I'm very wary of calling those things mindsets. I don't think they're mindsets. I think they're skill sets. And then there are people some people ask a lot of questions, others don't. Some people like to know a lot about the context of what they're doing, others are happy with the silos, and that's a different thing.
Okay.
It really wouldn't hurt for, kind of an engineer to go on a very kind of, focused course on kind of product management and learning the skills involved in being a product manager and vice versa. And I'd highly encourage that with somebody who's from both kind of backgrounds.
Some of the most successful product people I ever met and worked with came from engineering background, even if it was just a couple of years early on. It just gives you a good sense of, what the team you're working with is actually dealing with day to day.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really know of many engineers who were product managers before, though. That's an interesting thing.
I know a few, but yeah, there's a lot of overlap. And the way I typically break it down is I look at the what, the why, the who, and the why. And the key thing, and you can say, oh, it's not about mindset, it's about skills. But the point I'm trying to make is from the outset is we're all involved throughout those 4 stages. And it's not like a waterfall kind of sequential thing. It's continuous, those 4 aspects.
But it's the same thing of like, there's no business mindset. Like we just have, thoughts and ideas and we're trying to do our jobs. I think it's creating silos if you start talking about those separations of people.
Mm-hmm.
I agree to disagree, because I think the reality is, especially in some of the environments I've seen, that it's just a different way of looking at the world or tackling a problem. I mean, but that's my view, I guess.
Okay, I've got another question. Do keep them coming in. This one, I guess the relationship works best when everyone in the business understands the product. Some companies work in niche industries where the product is very complex or difficult to understand. This creates key person risks for those that understand the product, and also difficulty with onboarding. Any tips on what to do in this kind of situation?
Just reading the question, sorry, it's quite long.
I think understanding the onboarding kind of process, and the majority of companies I walk into don't have an onboarding process for engineers, and it's very much go talk to that person over there, and he'll kind of like help you get set up. But I think they should be some of the best kind of companies I've had. They make you do kind of like a certification exercise on the product, and the whole point is that you get to build a complete thread all the way through the kind of product in order to understand all the different touch points, and that by far has been the best approach to actually kind of onboarding and learning a product that I've experienced as an engineer. But
for me, I would add to that is onboarding not just engineers, product people, designers onto the customer as well. And that also, going to the first part of that question, that sometimes helps to also reduce the complexity of a product, because internally, yes, we are aware of all the complexities and how the product works or doesn't work or what it should be doing. But as soon as you speak to customers, suddenly, I wouldn't say the complexity goes away, that wouldn't be doing it justice, but you get a much better understanding of how they see the product, what the outcome is in terms of when they use the product. So I would encourage, and I actively try to do this, is get engineers at any point of their stint at the company involved with, customer conversations, listening in at minimum.
Yeah, I love that shadowing kind of customer service teams.
Yeah.
One of the best experience of, like, for me personally and for many of engineers on my teams. Also because I worked in kind of companies that have a physical product fulfillment side of this, where we run the software in kind of fulfillment centers, shadowing our internal, customers, which are the operations team, helping them, through the flow on the floor of the warehouse, also super helpful. That's basically when you see people using the product that you build is really when you understand your product much better. And I agree that, like, you have to get to a certain level of maturity with a company to have that as part of your onboarding, especially in the technology teams. Yeah.
Okay, great. Another question, an interesting one here. So who is responsible for adding resource in order to deliver the product vision? Engineering, product, or both? And what mechanisms are used to work out how many you need?
And when we say resource, are we talking about people?
I think we're talking about people, yes. So
We call them
more people to deliver.
Yeah.
Do you add them in product, engineering, and how do you decide, and who decides?
From my experience, it's a joint conversation, particularly in those setups where I work closely with a CTO or head of technology. You look at it together, a bit almost like you do Three Amigos on a sprint level, right? You sit together, you work through, like, what have we got coming up this quarter? What are the big projects, or where's the complexity? Where were you light on the ground? And then you revisit that conversation as you go on. And that's how you do it. And I think also where the question is maybe also coming from in terms of trade-offs that you have to make if you have a finite number of people that can work on a set number of products or projects or initiatives, is that typically, with a good product person, good engineer, you can really make those prioritization decisions going back to the objectives that we talked about.
Yeah, I think it's critical. I'm going through this with the kind of I was CPO in the business at the moment, and we're looking at the way you add resource, but also looking at how those teams are formed and the differences between them. The relationships between them in terms of work collaboration, what happens, and then how the kind of system is actually structured underneath also plays a big part in that, as to how they perform with it. But for every kind of 5 engineers, you're looking at a ratio of QAs and product managers in relation to that. So I don't think you can consider just engineering in kind of its in a silo. You have to look at the other parts of the business and how they interact with it.
Yeah, I agree. And I also want to add on that, because I agree with everything you guys said. I want to add to that it's not just product side where the kind of plan comes out from. There's also going to be work that kind of technology needs to bring to the table. I'm a big fan of making sure that as we plan, whether it's resource planning or any type of planning, you want to see all of the work. And I think a lot of the time you kind of only look at the product roadmap really, and you don't consider things like, oh, actually we have this big upgrade plan for our, platform setup, or, we have to do this big refactoring piece underneath this. You need to look at all of the work and consider how you're going to resource all of it. Otherwise, you're running obviously into problems later down the line.
I think value attribution is a good kind of thing to look at, and because we talk about customer value, but the business value actually has a big impact on that as well. And if you look at kind of architectural capability, if you look at developer efficiency actually helps you with customer value, right? If it takes 3 months to ship a feature because you've got crappy release processes and things take so long, there's a real kind of value in optimizing those so you can actually deliver to the customer things faster. So you have to consider the platform, and I always encourage people to come up with a platform roadmap for the next 12 months. What are they going to deliver in terms of infrastructure? What architectural capability needs to be put there? And then you get to negotiate between the two of you on product and platform, what goes into the roadmap, what you do to make sure you've got a kind of healthy product.
And Dan, can I ask people in the audience, because I'd love to know what kind of this, because this is obviously a holy grail for not just product people, lots of businesses. To John's point about prioritization, I think in ASOS we're doing that well, where we're not just looking at revenue, but you're also looking at enablers, for instance, or you're looking at customer experience aspects that you can't necessarily translate straight away into revenue. So you capture it all, as John says. But I'd love to know from people in the audience how they have that conversation and what kind of criteria they look at. If people want to share.
Yeah, great. There's a chat window there in the I don't know if you can see it, Mark, but in the right hand side, and people are writing things in there. So that would be a great thing to feedback, to show us that you're all listening. I know you are, because you're all asking questions, but a good point there. So another one come in here, which is a bit of a devil's advocate one, but if an organization is successful at getting engineers fully engaged at the solution level, is there then need for product people? Could fear of this be why, in my experience, product people can be reluctant to let engineers really drive solutions?
If they can also drive the problems, then yes, then you've got the product mindset in my point of view. I know Marta feels about that differently, but if you can really look at the problems and the solutions, whether you're an engineer, startup, founder, designer, QA, doesn't matter, then you don't necessarily need someone with the product manager title to do that, right? Because you're all going through that mindset of, we start with a problem, we start with the customer, we ask the right questions, we then start thinking about the solution, breaking it down, looking at the data, going back again. I would argue that for me, again, that's a mindset or approach, if you want to call it that, and there's some skills that come under that, but those are not exclusive to a product person in my experience.
I totally agree that if you can get an engineer to play the role that product manager plays, and they want to do it, then the person that plays the role of product manager is the product manager, yes. However, I would say that just from joining a problem kind of planning meeting, engineer is not going to step over this product manager. It's a long path from I participated in a plan to I actually took over as a product manager for the team, right? It's a big gap between those two things. And I think there's a lot of flexibility and a lot of space for engineers to kind of move in that direction still.
Yeah.
I think, at least my kind of, and I'd love to kind of hear other people's feedback on this, but the concept of a product engineer is very much a kind of West Coast, kind of North American kind of concept, and I've seen it lots of kind of, at least on the West Coast, similar to Silicon Valley when I worked there, and I don't see it so much in Europe, and I've I've always asked myself why is, because I mean, commercially kind of focused kind of engineer, I think would have massive impact within the business, provided you like you said, Mark, that they are focusing on the problems as well as just building a solution, which isn't. Yeah, I mean, you can look at Killed by Google and look at some things and go, did a product manager come up with that, or was there an engineer, or was it somewhere in between?
And the reality is, so even with the West Coast, and they are definitely ahead when it comes to product maturity, product mindset, whatever you want to call it. But the reality is, and I'm always at pains to demystify this idea of a product manager as a rock star, and we're all related to Steve Jobs, and we woke up one day with a great idea for a product and we built it and it was fantastic. And, it's not how it works. It really isn't. A key part of what a product person does, in my view and in my experience, is bring lots of people together. Yes, that doesn't mean that you're not allowed to have your own ideas as a product person and use that as a starting point. That's absolutely fine. But our role is much more about, acting as not just as a facilitator, but really bringing people together and creating that alignment. And again, you don't have to be a product manager to do that. A good engineer can do that. A good startup founder can do that. One of the other reasons why I try to demystify that idea of this product rock star is because I get people who are working in small business and say, I don't have a product person. And it's difficult times at the moment. I'm screwed. And I said, no, you don't have to be. This is what you can do yourself to start thinking in that product way, to start with the problem, to talk to customers.
Of realizing, who's doing those things right now if you don't have a product person? Those still happening, right? It's still happening. It's interesting. I think the role of product manager, to your point, is very different in a bigger organization. The bigger the organization is, the more ideas you have to kind of come from different places, right? There's going to be a lot of people who care deeply about your product and your customers and your platform. And I think you're right that it shifts almost to somebody who can facilitate those ideas and create a vision, coherent vision that can be then turned into a product.
Yeah.
In the early stages, I don't say that everybody's a Steve Jobs, but like you kind of are, right? You kind of are driving that vision of product much more firmly in early stages of a product and a company.
I think the other thing, apart from when you asked about the product mindset, and Ken is touching on that, looking at the comments on the right-hand side of our screen, is, the product person is the voice of the customer. And again, I would say that's not exclusively a product person, but I've seen organizations where if you don't necessarily have that product person, it doesn't necessarily happen, and we forget about the customer almost. Whereas other organizations where they don't have a product person, but they do it anyway, it happens automatically.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We've got a number of questions in that area. One is, do you ever let the engineer communicate with the client? And then another one further on, how would you encourage engineering teams to spend time with the customer without it seeming like a chore for them, especially with meetings? Anyone want to pick up those points?
Yeah, so 2 questions. If I can, definitely engineers meeting with the client or an internal stakeholder, absolutely. Again, for me, that comes down to that trust point. Everyone should be able to talk to everyone. And yes, we'll prepare engineers for those conversations, especially if they don't necessarily have the context or they haven't met that client or stakeholder before. But it just really helps if everyone is on that journey and is in the same conversations, because otherwise, so much gets lost in translation. And, that customer engagement, I can see where the question is coming from, that it can feel onerous, but I try to keep it very simple. I've done this, I'd like to think, quite successfully, where I have engineers sitting in customer conversations that are 20 minutes, they sit in another room, or they might not even sit in and they watch the video at their own leisure. I've trained them, for those who are up for it, to ask questions to the customer directly. And again, part of what I do there when I talk about training is just demystifying it a little bit to make it feel less onerous and to remove that hurdles. And you're just talking to a customer, as long, make sure you don't ask too many leading questions, and you're good, right? And that already goes a long way in terms of removing some of the kind of the boundaries and the hurdles there.
Yeah, I think shadowing, like I said, CS is a great way to do it if you want to have a bit of a distance. For whatever reason, your customers may not be ready to talk with the engineers as well. Like, it depends on your business. So shadowing CS is a nice way to do it with like a training wheels. Shadowing customer research teams, what you're describing, it's a very engaging way as well, because you get to kind of see what they're doing, and like you say, you can manage your level of engagement. You can just watch a video. Another thing I would say is, for us, especially at Moo, attending events where our customers are there, and kind of just meeting them. Because Moo was a business card company, you would sometimes meet people in the wild with our business cards, and they would find out that, oh, I work at Moo, I have a business card, and when you start this conversation and suddenly you're talking with a customer about product without even realizing, on a tech recruitment event. But we also did some shadowing of our kind of marketing and customer teams in a sales event. So we would man the booth and help them out, and at the same time talk with people. So you get a day out of the office. Sometimes you get a free lunch. It's fun.
Okay, great. I'm not sure if everyone else is not seeing video, but I've lost video of all 3 of you one by one now. So hopefully everyone's still online and we can hear you all. Well, it could just be me, of course. Another question then, what techniques do you suggest that can help engineering get more involved in the product discovery process without jumping straight into the solution?
Techniques. I mean, in my experience, a lot of those techniques do come from product managers that engage with my teams. We did there's a lot of different ways to facilitate planning conversations. There are workshops you can do. There are structures like opportunity trees that you can use to map things out and drive the discovery. There's the 2-diamond kind of approach to discovery and then delivery as well. There's a lot of frameworks that people use that, frankly, I don't have much experience beyond just Googling them and trying to apply them in real time. I think what's important is that you try to find a way, something that will work for your team. and you know best what's going to engage them. Is it going to be post-it notes on a wall, or is it going to be, asynchronously editing a document on Google Docs? And pick that framework, pick the tool that's going to get you the outcome that you're going after. That's kind of my rule of thumb kind of approach to that.
And two very simple techniques that I personally like and have used a lot over the years. One is a design sprint. And again, I don't have people on the call are familiar with that, but the idea that you, in 4 or 5 days, or maybe even less, cross-functional group of people, look at a problem, pick a problem, and at the end of the sprint, they have some sort of prototype, and that can just be a piece of paper, which they test with customers. Again, not just for engineers, but that's a really nice way to get a whole range of people involved from an early stage. And another thing that I find helpful, because it's so collaborative, is like story mapping, where, again, maybe because I'm old school, you get some index cards out and you start mapping the customer journey, or you start, and you use it as a way to look at where you can improve or where the pain points are. But it's so easy, particularly if you do it in person, because you all stand around the table and you play with post-it notes and index cards. Who doesn't like that?
I did this a couple of years ago with running a user journey mapping workshop with a product company that was stuck with a build because they didn't know what they wanted to build, and the engineers were kind of loved the whole process of seeing it, because they were like, oh, okay, we understand like where this comes from now, and there was collaboration, dialogue on it, and that was like really valuable for them to see that. But they couldn't get there on their own, and it was something that we had to bring a product manager in to actually do, because they just didn't have the experience with it. But still, after they'd done it, they were like, okay, we'd like to be involved in this more. And also, by the way, when you do kind of user interviews, what do they look like as well? So can we see those? So I think there is a curiosity element there once you show them that, hang on a sec, we don't just come up with this stuff and tell you what to build. There's a process to get to where we've ended up.
Okay, great. Another one here, interesting one. Thinking of autonomous and diverse teams where product and engineering work well together, how do you handle activities that require a specific skill, like doing customer interviews, shadowing, and don't really need a diverse team? So I guess, how do you handle it when there's a particular skill as opposed to more kind of cross-functional teams?
Yeah, if you're lucky, you'll see if you can find that very specific expert skill outside of the team. But the reality is, especially if you work in a smaller setup, you don't, right? So it has to come out of that cross-functional team. If you have to work, if you want to do customer interviews, then you don't have a whole in-house user research team. But what you do then is, as a group, you start looking at ways of, okay, our goal is to have 5 customer interviews by the end of next week. How are we going to do it? Mm-hmm. And then you find out, you can divide and conquer, and you can say, well, the product person or an engineer who's got an interest in that's going to watch a few videos online on how to speak to customers or look into the logistics. So you farm that out a little bit more. And you just learn, you learn as you go. Whereas obviously, if you have a dedicated user research team, for example, you rely on them if you don't have those skills within your team, because that's what they're for.
Mm-hmm. I think also the goal here is not to necessarily reduce number of people that are doing the job. The goal here is to ensure that engineers have a way to interact with customers and interact with that process. Yeah. So I think, because of course within the technology team you will have very specific and specially skill set people who have to do certain jobs that nobody else will do, and you don't necessarily have like product shadowing engineers as they're upgrading a database, right? Like you don't necessarily do that. I think the value that we're trying to realize here is that you want engineers to feel more connected to the customer and the product. So even if there's somebody highly specialized doing the work, there's still value for an engineer to shadow them and observe it. And if there's a scenario where you think your product manager understanding the complexity of upgrading a system or implementing a feature would be of value for them, then you would do it the other way around. You would have product managers shadowing engineers doing something like that.
And I love things like, because it works both ways, doesn't it, Marta? Where you also want a product person be, more closely connected to the engineers and understand their world a bit better. So I love hackathons where, again, you've got these cross-functional teams working very closely on something they've come up themselves and they've applied the product lifecycle, whatever it is, together. I think it works both ways.
Yeah.
A question as well for your panel here about who should the teams listen to. So there's questions where the CEO is particularly keen on maybe from a background of product or technology, or has particular ideas that he wants to push, which may not agree with what other teams prioritize. Who should the people on the ground listen to in those circumstances, and what options have they got to influence the outcome to ways that perhaps are more fairer or more actually give better business value even?
Well, first of all, they should listen to themselves.
I mean, I think it's really hard to ask engineers to say no to a CEO. If you're living in an organization and CEO can come up to you and tell you, do this, I think it's a really hard thing to say to an engineer, say no to the boss of the boss of the boss. When I do work with C-level kind of leaders or my peers, and they ask me that question, why cannot I go and tell the team to implement the feature that I like? I always say you have to trust the process. We hired the best people to scope, prioritize the work, and ensure that the right problems are being solved at the right time. If you're not seeing the right problems being solved at the right time, your problem is not with engineers. Don't go and bother them. Your problem is with that process of prioritization and scoping and delivery. And let's talk about that. Don't go and try to influence the teams and get them to implement the feature, your pet project. But it's a tough call. But I think as leaders, we owe it to our teams to protect them from that and divert the attention away from what is specific engineer doing or specific team doing, to how our organization is, planning and prioritizing work that our teams are delivering.
Yeah, I don't know. I want to be a bit more like John, who is a pirate, and I want people to, and I encourage people, let's say, where, yes, I agree with Marta, where you say as leaders, you set out direction. I think a big part of our roles is to give that clarity of direction. But I think within that, at that high level, and that's where empowered teams come back, is, anyone can come up with their ideas, anyone can challenge. I think what it does mean is that you have to be very transparent about how you come to a decision, but also give people the tools and the confidence to say no. So I spend a lot of time, even with product people, because, most people are, I wouldn't say, I don't want to generalize, but yes, it is a big thing to stand up to a passionate founder or a very strong CEO, or say no or push back, or be that one person in the room that says, hold on a minute, I don't agree. But there's so many ways of doing that. So one of the things that I encourage product people, designers and engineers to do is like a very simple opportunity assessment, which is a one-pager, and apply that both through your own ideas as well as through ideas that other people come to you with. And just even for sanity, right? Even if you don't want to do it, going back to the earlier question, but you have to just understand why we're doing this. Why now? Can we not do it elsewhere or outsource it? Or do we buy or build? That's a very simple opportunity assessment, but it really helps to then go back to a stakeholder or someone saying, I hear your question and I get the idea, but have you considered X, Y, Z? Or should we look at these options? So you're not saying a blunt no. Don't know why I wanted to say that in Dutch first. But you've also thought about some of the options. So then you have a conversation.
And I love it, because what you described is just process and tools to give your team to manage that. Yeah, I love that. Sorry.
But the tendency sometimes, I think, is to say no, and you probably shouldn't say no. You should probably kind of talk them through things. And I think that people forget that founders are going on a journey themselves, right? And they're constantly learning about this. And often they don't start off as kind of the sole founder with any of the product skills. They might have kind of built the pitch deck and kind of they've done the business model and they've recruited a team to do it. But it takes them, some founders, several years to really go, okay, I understand. We don't focus on individual kind of output of engineers. We don't focus on kind of going to teams and actually telling them what to do. There's a reality of kind of which is let them figure it out sometimes. But and you really have to take that founder on a journey, particularly with some of the kind of the early stage startups, to get them to understand that product mindset and the way that teams should work, autonomous teams with good ideas who can solve problems with themselves. They don't need to be told what to do.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's great. Thank you for all your insights there. All three of you, thank you for coming along and answering the questions. And thanks to the audience as well for all these great questions. I see there's even more coming in now. There's, it's kind of a bottomless bucket full of these great questions. So keep up the discussion on the Slack channel. If you haven't joined CTO Craft, then please do visit the website and join up. And look forward to seeing you all on the next one of these. So from me, take care and see you soon. Bye.
Thanks.
For having me.